So I worked a lot with Muslim Kurdish individuals as we were on Mount Ararat in Turkey. We're about 10 clicks away from Iran, so we're in kind of a very interesting part of the world. A lot of Persians are on the mountain at the same time of us, or Iranians, whichever label you prefer. But these Kurdish gentlemen had a very definitive construct for justice. In fact, the whole world does. It's called karma. You reap what you sow. You do bad, you're going to reap bad. You do good, hopefully you reap good. But sometimes that gets all mixed up, and you get these Job-like characters that are doing all this really good stuff, and still bad stuff happens. And so we had this sense of betrayal, like, man, there's got to be something more to life than that, because sometimes bad things happen to good people. And so we sense this level of deep betrayal, like, where is God on that day when that situation happened? And we walk away from it either getting our answers, or if we're fortunate enough, and if we're persevering enough, God gives us the gift of himself. And I find a lot of times with tragedy, and I'll talk about mine here in just a moment, very briefly, when tragedy hits, when trauma hits, when the day of the dragon comes, when the darkness comes and the shadows come, whatever that situation is, you know what I'm talking about. You can just basically put in words and names and places into those margins. We have two opportunities. We can either come to God and say, I deserve answers, and we can posture ourselves like Job and say, you know what? I don't understand what's going on, but I demand that you, the Almighty, answer my questions. The problem is they're bad questions. And the problem is, if God answers those questions, you will explode into infiniteness. You can't handle, it's almost like a Jack Nicholson thing. You can't handle the truth. You will explode. You don't have the bandwidth. And so God has to take Job into this situation, into an audience of one, where all the counselors and friends and all the chaos and his own pain is quiet, and his wife, everything. It's just him and God. And he has this epiphany where he begins to realize that it's quite simple. God is God and he's not. And more than that, God gives Job the gift of himself. And instead of answering Job's bad questions or his unanswerable questions, God gives Job his unquestionable self. And that is a beautiful thing, and I'm telling you that is probably one of the hardest things to get to, because we all want answers. But essentially when we're doing that, we're trying to tell God how to do his job. And we're angry and we're hurt. Job did everything right, but he did everything based out of fear. He was always afraid. So he made offerings for his kids that partied too much the night before. He was the most righteous man. He gave, he was generous, and God blessed him. But then piece by piece, his world fell completely apart to the extent where he lost everything, and he's just sitting on a pile of ashes, and he's just scraping away his sores, and he's ashamed, and nobody wants to talk to him anymore. And his name and his integrity has been tarnished, and everybody's trying to point out what devotional he missed, or what secret spiritual formula he missed, or what service he missed, or if he didn't read his Bible enough, or if he didn't do enough good things. And so they're nitpicking at all these things, and then God shows up and says, look, guys, first of all, tell your friends to be quiet because they don't know what they're talking about. There is another narrative that's going on in this man's life that we don't. Now, as readers, we have this privilege, but Job did not have this privilege. So when the book of Job was written, we see that there's this whole other sub-narrative that's going on. And we don't have privy to it, and we can't access it. But what's happening is that God and Satan, the origins of light and darkness, are basically basing their reputation on a single man. And the devil comes in, as you know the tale tells. He comes in and says, look, this guy is a great man, and you've blessed him. And it's easy to say good things about God when things are going well, but just take away some of that stuff. Take it away, and we'll see what comes out of this man's mouth. And so over the course of time, all of his stuff is taken away, and he's left with nothing, and God says, you can take everything, but not his life. Now, notice very carefully and clearly, the origin of evil is not emanating from God. But because he is so powerful and he's so sovereign, even evil is one of his servants. So be careful what you call evil, because I think what we call evil, sometimes God just says, no, that's just one of my servants. So we have all these bad kings that are running around in the Old Testament narrative that were bad and did bad things, and God calls them my servant Cyrus, my servant Darius, my servant Nebuchadnezzar. And so I think evil is really this dog, this mangy dog that's on a leash, and the leash is grace, and God uses evil to accomplish a greater good. Now, if I was God, I don't know if I would do it that way. because it can sabotage people and it can leave them spiritually bankrupt, but we have to trust in God's integrity and in the bigger picture that he knows what he's doing. And so Job gets to this point where he's like, wow, I need an audience of one, and then God fills him with himself, and then his life doesn't really matter a whole lot anymore. Why? Because God showed up. It's amazing how all of your questions go away when God shows up. When he fills you with his presence, and all the stuff in your past becomes less and less and less. It's almost like taking a step into the other dimension, into heaven, and you can begin to realize that all the things that you were so consumed with on earth mean nothing in the larger view. In fact, that stigma and that pain and that grief, it can't even attach itself to you when you enter into heaven, because it can't belong there. There's no real estate for that type of human suffering. And so I think what God was trying to do with Job is just bring him to that place where he just gave him a slice of heaven, just a little piece, and then we know that his story turned around.